Hello, my name is Heaven Estrada, and for my final project, I decided to create this presentation that analyzes the links between colonization and environmental hazards, and specifically focusing on how they affect indigenous communities. The title for my presentation is Land is Sacred, Water is Life, the links between colonization and environmental hazards. First, I would like to look at life pre-colonization. There were an estimated 60 million people living in the Americas. They had a reciprocal relationship with the land in which they did not overuse it, particularly with farming. They used traditional polyculture farming, so where different plants were planted together in order to help each other grow, opposed to monocultural farming that we see today. Even now, we see indigenous people caring for the land, as we see through this quote, compromising less than 5% of the world's population, indigenous people protect 80% of the global biodiversity. Now let's talk more about how colonization affected this. Colonization brought along many devastating and traumatic concepts and ideas to the Americas. Three concepts that I identified that relate to increased environmental hazards are individualism, capitalism, and white supremacy. The first concept is individualism, which is the idea that people only think of their items, themselves, their immediate family over the general community. So an example of when this was introduced was through the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. This broke up tribal land and provided families or individuals land based on their size that they had to tend to themselves for a certain period of time. They're allowed to come together as a community, care for the land, or sell the land. This caused a loss of 2 million acres of land and 80% of land wealth, so land with the most natural resources that could be used. Next thing that colonization brought were ideas of capitalism to the Americas. With capitalism, as seen in the Story of Stuff video, there is a drive to produce more and more stuff, and this leads to more pollution in the world, which ultimately leads to climate change. And the third concept is white supremacy. So this is connected to environmental hazards through environmental racism, in which we see people of color are more affected by environmental hazards. They're the one placed to live by refineries or freeways, so they get more exposures to toxins or toxicants. And these concepts all contribute to indigenous people experiencing more environmental hazards. And now we'll go into examples. The first example is the water contamination in the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is one of the largest reservations with 27,000 square miles that span Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. And the reservations were created through settler colonial policies. And on the reservation, there are 521 abandoned uranium mines that are contaminating the water supplies on the reservation. And so this is bringing many health concerns such as developmental disorders and cancers to up to 40% of the 340,000 people who live on the reservation. And so when the EPA did testing, they found 43 parts per billion of uranium in the water when the limit is 30 parts per billion. And there's also a lot of community involvement that bring clean water to people that don't have clean running water. And so this is kind of breaking out of the idea of individualism and bringing in the more like traditional community values. And this is also an example of how colonial ideas and policies affect indigenous people today and are bringing them more exposed to environmental hazards. My second example focuses on Hawaii, which was illegally occupied in 1893. As you can see from this picture, there are a lot of development that happened on the island. This development with the increase in travel and tourism brings in the threat of invasive species to the native plants and animals there can cause harm. And there also, through the occupation and military testing in Hawaii, there has been reports of water contamination due to the Department of Defense testing. And in Hawaii, we see that there are many environmental justice campaigns ran by Native Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli to protect the land, which is also tied into the fight for sovereignty and getting land back into the hands of Native Hawaiians. The third example is one that we talked about in class, in which indigenous Arctic communities are being affected by pollution, toxicants in the world, specifically Inuit. We see examples of bioaccumulation and biomagnification of toxicants within their traditional foods, so any fish, seal, or whales, which ultimately affect the Inuit people as they eat the animals, and then it leads into bioaccumulation into their bodies of these toxicants. And there's also climate change, which is disrupting their homelands and their access to food. Another item that is disrupting their ability to practice their traditional ways is policies that stop them from hunting seals or whales, which they have done in a sustainable manner for thousands and thousands of years. So if you want to learn more about that, here is a movie that I recommend, Angry Inuk, which focuses on the fight Inuit people go through to protect their hunting and their land. It also talks a bit about climate change and bioaccumulation, biomagnification. And now here are some ways that you can support the land, the water, and the people. First is to know whose land you occupy, whether it be where you permanently live or if you're visiting a place. I always like to research the indigenous people or like what's happening within the place that I'm going to visit, so I know how to best support the original people of the land. And so just listening and learning from the stewards of the land. If they say, like, don't go visit this place, don't go on that hike, it's sacred to us, making sure to listen and respect them. And if you have the resources, donating to people and being sure to spread awareness. And I state mindfully spread awareness to keep in the concepts of cultural humility and amplifying people's voices and not speaking over people if it's not your community. Thank you for listening, and here are the resources that I pulled my information from.